Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Diana Lebo-Posner, and I am the Principal Librarian, Associate Director of the Exploration and Creativity Department. And I'm here today with my amazing colleague, Senior Librarian Celia Avila. Welcome to today's Your Author program, presented by our generous donors, the Greenbergs and the Library Foundation. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Latinx author Ana Marie McLemore. Ms. McLemore is a queer binary YA author who writes magical realism, fairy tales, and fantasy.
They are the author of Weight of Feathers, which was a finalist for the 2016 William C. Morris Debut Award, When the Moon Was Ours, which was a 2017 Stonewall Honor Book, and also longlisted for the National Book Award in the Young People's Literature category. Wild Beauty, which was a Kirkus School Library Journal and Booklist Best Book of 2017, and Blanca and Roja, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. Today we'll be discussing Dark and Deepest Red, a retelling of Hans Christian Andersen's The Red Shoes. And Ana Marie, would you like to start us off with a short reading?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. And before I start fanboying about LAPL, I will start with a reading from the very beginning of Dark and Deepest Red. Sorry, I'm getting used to being mirrored here. I have to hold the book over here. Okay, I'm ready. Rosea. My mother told me once that being in Oliva meant measuring our lives in lengths of red thread. And probably that was true. But growing up in Briar Meadow meant I measured mine by the glimmer that appeared over the reservoir every year. That was what they called the strangeness that settled onto our town for a week each October, a glimmer, both for the wavering light that hovered above the water and because it seemed like the right word for the flicker of magic that came with it. One year, the glimmer stirred the air between neighbors who hated each other. Families who'd become enemies over fence lines and tree roots suddenly burst into each other's kitchens, trading long secret recipes for tomato sauce or spice cookies. Another year, it was icicles that tasted like rose candies. My mother and I ate them all week, licking them like paletas, and tried to save some in our freezer. When the glimmer left at the end of the week, we found them vanished from between the frozen peas and waffles and managed to be surprised. My abuela called us fools for thinking we could hold onto Briar Meadow's magic any longer than the glimmer let us. And once it was the thorns on the trees and bushes around town. They grew so fast, even I could sit still long enough to watch them. The wood twisted into shapes, some simple as a corkscrew curl, others intricate as the figurine of a deer, others as sharp as little knives. Sometimes we woke up to find blood dripping down the points, and we couldn't be sure if someone had pricked their fingers or if the thorns themselves were bleeding. And maybe my mother was right about measuring our lives in red thread, because those drops of blood looked to me like the beads on the most beautiful shoes my family made. Red shoes, the kind everyone knew us for. They bought other colors, of course, but it was the red ones that carried the whisper of a magic not so different from the glimmer. Our red shoes bore the hint of something forbidden and a little scandalous. Parents bought them for anxious brides who then kissed their grooms with enough passion to make the wedding guests blush. Women had pairs made for class reunions, strutting into the tinsel-draped auditorium like queens. Husbands gave them to their wives before trips meant to celebrate 20 or 30-year anniversaries, and the couple always came back with their eyes glinting as though they'd just met. Well-crafted seams and delicate beading gave my family a trade and a living. But red shoes gave us a name. They made us infamous. They made us brazen. Until they came for us. Except that's not quite true. They didn't come for us. They came for me. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much. I could listen to you read forever. I love the way you set it up so wonderfully. Like your language is so beautiful and vivid. Like I can put myself where they're at. We had talked about it a little bit prior, but can you tell us how you developed the idea for Dark and Deepest Red? I know Diane and I were both shocked as we were reading it that it actually is something that happened in 1518.
I know it's this weird corner of history, isn't it? Where it sounds a little bit like something that's made up or something that got like exaggerated across generations of tellings. But we have these historical accounts that from all appearances seem to be recording this thing that actually happened. And these medieval dancing plagues where people started dancing uncontrollably, first a few at a time and then dozens or hundreds, they've happened throughout history, and there were several of them in that happened in medieval Alsace in present-day France. But this one, the 1518 Strasbourg dancing plague, it was one of the biggest, and it was probably the best documented. And it started with this one woman who started dancing uncontrollably and just kept dancing for days beyond what seemed physically possible. And then she was joined by a few other dancers, and then more and more until it was dozens. And then I think it was up to about 500. Don't quote me on that. It's been a little while since I've been deep in this research, and now I'm doing research for another book. So my research numbers are a little bit mixing up together. But it was hundreds of people, and there we have more historical record about this one, so that we can really picture it. We really have these accounts that either were during this time period or that were shortly after. So so they're pretty close in terms of saying what happened. So I got really into this idea of dancing plagues because they both sort of horrified me and also interested me. Growing up as a young dancer, doing this art that is sort of all-consuming and that you love, but also sweeps you away in a way that can be a little disconcerting sometimes. And that has so many parallels to the Hans Christian Andersen story of the red shoes. For anyone who doesn't know it, it's about this girl who really wants these red shoes, and when she finally gets these red dancing shoes, they make her dance uncontrollably, and they make her keep dancing. It's actually this very frightening story. It's beautiful, but also frightening. And I think I see the beauty of it because I grew up loving dancing so much. But even though you have these parallels, and you actually have some historical parallels that I won't spoil because they're in the book, and there's more of that in the book. But I didn't put these two things directly together at first. At first, I was thinking about the Strasbourg dancing plague, and I was thinking, I want to write about this, and I don't know specifically how I'm going to do it. And I was thinking about this when I was in one of my dancing classes a few years ago, and I was thinking about this when I should have been thinking about the steps that I was supposed to be learning. And one of my classmates in this class, her daughter, I found out about this after, pointed at me and said, "Mommy, I want to dance like her. I want to dance like the girl in the red shoes." And that was it. That was when I thought, oh my gosh, that's it. The story of the red shoes. Because I'd been wearing these red practice shoes to do my dance classes in. And so it was kind of funny that I had that sign of it on my feet, but it took my friend's daughter saying that for me to really put together and realize these two stories go together. And I would find out later in the research process that there are these sort of secret historical links between the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, The Red Shoes, and this specific instance of the dancing plague.
So fascinating. We need a nonfiction book too now. It's amazing.
It's so interesting. And the book I referred to was Helena Gottman's Choreomania, which is this really, really dense academic book. So it took me a while to get through because it's this very scholarly text, and she's done such incredible work. But that was one of the texts that I really got into, and I got to learn about some of these sources, and I got to learn about some of the other dancing plagues. And I'm very grateful to the scholars in Strasbourg who helped me access some of the primary and close secondary sources about this kind of incredible moment in history.
Wow, I know it hit home for me too. When I was a young child, I had ballet folklorico, and I remember I was into it. But when I put on the dress, for me it was the dress. Then all of a sudden, I was all about it, and it was just like they couldn't get the dress off of me, so I would stop dancing.
Oh, the dresses are beautiful. I completely understand. That's probably part of the reason like my parents never let me wear one of those dresses. It would never come off. I would live in it.
That's me. On to the next question. How do you preserve your heritage and identity in your writing?
So for me, it was more about letting my heritage and letting my identity into my writing. Part of the process of me learning to write stories and learning to write stories that had life to them, that had my heart to them, was letting my identity in there. Because when I started trying to write these stories that I kind of did in secret because I was very slow to tell anybody that I was a writer, that I wanted to be a writer, I started with the kinds of stories that I thought I was supposed to write, which is, like adult, white, cis, heterosexual men. And because I don't have an access point to that experience, because that experience didn't speak to me. Not that you can never write outside of your own identity, but it was something I didn't have my heart in. Stories were just kind of bloodless. They didn't have a lot of life into them. But because that's what I thought that I was supposed to do, it took me a while to sort of like let myself in. And when I ultimately did that, I did that in steps. I started letting a little bit of my communities in there, and then a little more, until eventually I wrote what would become my debut novel, The Weight of Feathers, which is about a family of Mexican American performing mermaids and their sort of rivalry with this family of French Romany performers who are descended from tightrope walkers and who now perform in trees wearing these enormous wings. And that was a story that was about this romance between these two brown teens, and it was very much a straight story, and it was something that I didn't let my queer identity into, but because it had my Latinx identity, because it had so much of that in there, even that felt like more than I thought I was allowed to do. So I was so grateful and so frankly surprised when that book was picked up, when that book was embraced by readers, and when I found these readers who had wanted the same thing that I wanted growing up. We wanted to see ourselves on shelves. So after I wrote Weight of Feathers, after Weight of Feathers came out, and after it was received in ways that I was so grateful for, I thought I sort of went backwards a little bit, because I thought I need to be a good little author, and I thought I'd gotten away with something by writing this book between these two brown teens, this book where I wrote so much about my Latinx community. So I tried going about writing like a really white, really straight, really cis book, because that's what I thought I was supposed to do. Like, nobody told me that. It was just these things that we sort of pick up and we sort of think that we're told. So anyone who's read my second book, When the Moon Was Ours, at this point is probably wondering, like, how did you get from the point you're oh, thank you so much. Anyone who's thinking about that book is probably thinking, how did you get from trying to write a white, straight, heterosexual, cis book to getting to When the Moon Was Ours, which is a book about a queer Latina girl and a Pakistani American transgender boy. So how I got there was because when I was trying to write my second book, which I was trying to make this very white, straight, cis book because I thought I was supposed to. And because it wasn't what I wanted to write, it was just bad. It was just so bad. And my poor editor went through and I don't think she even knew that I had these voices in my head telling me what I thought I had to write. And we went through a few rounds, trying to make this ultimately just not very good book into what I thought, something better, but still what I thought it was supposed to be. And there was this point where she said, I forget what exactly she said, but it was something like, if this is the book you want to be your second book, I will send it, we will send it to production, on the strength of your writing, on the strength of how you use language. We will send it to production if this is the book you want to be your second book. And I needed somebody to ask me that. Like she wasn't pressuring me. I just needed someone to actually ask me, is this what you want? And I told her, like, no, like, can you get me more time to write this book? And I wrote it again from scratch. And I'm not going to say that it was this kind of fearless process, because it absolutely wasn't. It was just, one, I wrote it so fast because I had to for the schedule. But that was a great blessing, because my fear of missing my deadline became greater than my fear of writing this story from my queer Latinx trans heart. So if I hadn't had that pressure, if I hadn't had my fear sort of shifted into the, okay, I have to make this deadline place, and away from the I can't let myself into stories place, I don't know if I ever would have written that book. So that sort of broke me out of my fear. And the way that book was received and the way that book was welcome, I am so grateful for it. And that was the point where I thought, oh, okay, I can't really go back to writing the books that I think I'm supposed to write. So even though there was, that process was hard, and that process did involve fear and overcoming certain fear about letting who I am and letting my communities into my books, I'm so thankful that it happened, because it moved me forward in a way that I think would have been hard to do if I hadn't had the help of people, like, moving me in the direction of really embracing who I am on the page.
Yeah, absolutely. And that representation, it matters a lot. Like for me, one of the things I really love in your work is that I see parts of myself in there, my abuela, las paletas that you were talking about. And even, in Dark and Deepest Red, you talk a little bit about honoring your ancestors and the dead. And so for me, reading books when I was, years and years ago, when I was a young adult, I wish that there had been more of myself in them. So I really appreciate that you did not go back and you stuck to your voice and you're putting yourself into your work, because it matters, and it's really important for our youth to see themselves, and for anybody to see themselves in the books that they're reading. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think it's a process. It's ongoing for all of us. I have to, even though that process with When the Moon Was Ours was sort of that big moment, I have to sort of I have to sort of ask myself that again every time I write a book. Like when I wrote Dark and Deepest Red, the assumption, the very wrong assumption, is that that medieval stories in Europe have to be white, and they don't, because that's not the truth of, like, we have always been there. Like, brown people have been everywhere in history, and that was something that I knew, that I instinctually knew, but that I had to question with queerness, because I, like, this is embarrassing to admit, but like I've learned to just admit it. Like, I was someone who, at the same time that I said, yes, like, brown people have been everywhere throughout history, I thought that, and I knew that, at the same time that I thought that lesbians were invented in the 1960s. Like, so I had that sort of having to do that process with queerness and think, like, no, I wrote this book, and this, like, the sort of working title nickname for this book was Medieval Queers, because it became so much about queer identity in this corner of medieval Europe, and how this Romany girl who has these aspects of her identity that she can't share, and how this transgender boy that she falls in love with, and who falls in love with her, how they find their community even when we don't have they didn't have the same language for it that we have now. So it's in the same way that I kind of have to do this to some extent for every book. I think we do that throughout our lives, like claiming our identity, claiming who we are, and learning to not just claim it but celebrate it.
Yeah, exactly.
True.
So our next question, what was your relationship with books as a kid? And was there a particular book that inspired your love of reading or writing?
So I struggled a lot with reading, and I'm starting to actually, like, say the word. I'm dyslexic, so that's something that I've been really hesitant to admit, because I thought that I shouldn't admit it as a writer, and I thought I shouldn't admit it as someone who loves books. and who loves stories. Because even as I loved books and I loved stories, growing up, I didn't super love reading until I had enough practice at it to be able to sort of learn how to do it. Because I learned in a way that was very different from my peers. I learned very differently from the way I was told I was supposed to learn sometimes. And I really learned because I had family members and educators and librarians and community members who were willing to read with me, because that was how I learned to read. Like, having people who were willing to let me like look at the book while they were saying the words out loud. Like, this brings up a lot of feelings for me, because like I couldn't, like, even though I was slower to pick up on reading, I don't think I would have ever learned to love reading if it wasn't for people around me who cared and saw that even though I didn't appear to be a kid who liked reading, they could still tell that I was a kid who loved stories, and who were willing to have faith in that part of me, and who were willing to help me learn to love reading, because it was something that they were willing to do with me, and willing to do with groups of kids who would just sort of like, we would lose ourselves in being read to. And I think there's that magic that I'll never forget, and that I think of whenever I listen to audiobooks. And I think I love audiobooks partially because dyslexia makes my brain like tend a little more toward them, and also because it reminds me of that magic of being read to, and learning to read, and learning language through being read to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I also think definitely the Latinx culture. I know I grew up with hearing stories being told to me, and the folklore, and my mom had a hard time reading, and I didn't realize that until later, because it was always an oral tradition. Like, we would sit there, me and mis primos, listening to my abuela and my mom tell us stories. Then later I realized, and a lot of it was the language, because they might have been able to read in Spanish, but then they were having a hard time to read in English, or they had to learn language. So yeah. What advice would you give a child or a teen who wants to be a writer?
I think this sort of goes back to what I was talking about a little earlier, about like the stories you think you're supposed to write versus the stories that you actually want to write. And I think like my first piece of advice is go toward the stories of your heart. Like, go toward the stories that are calling you, because those are the ones that are going to truly shine with that kind of magic, and that kind of heart magic, and that beauty of who you are and your love for that story. So that's my usually starting place of advice, because that helps sustain you through all the work of writing the story and revising the story, whatever it is. That
Mm-hmm.
initial love, that place of wanting to write the story and loving the starting place of the story is what carries you through.
So I know we talked a little bit about putting yourself into the stories and how important that is. What advice would you give to young authors of color or youth who are interested in becoming authors, and how to find that authentic voice to put into their work?
I think one thing I would say is that who you are belongs in every kind of story. And this sort of connects with the idea of avoiding any kind of like monolithic narrative for identity, and making sure that there are lots of options on shelves, and lots of representations of all of our identities. Like, you belong in every kind of story, any kind of story that you want to write, any kind of story that you want to see a character like you in. Like, you belong there, like all genres, all kinds of stories, all different kinds of time periods. And I say that because that might, if that sounds obvious, then I think that's a wonderful thing. Like, if that sounds obvious and someone says like, well, yeah, of course I do, then that's beautiful. And I celebrate that. And I love that, because that was not obvious to me. And it's not obvious to a lot to a lot of writers that I get to work with and talk to, who are like, yeah, I can do that. So you belong in all of those kinds of stories. Our communities belong in all those stories.
Yeah.
Tell us about your writing process, and I also want you to talk about magical realism for people who might not really get magical realism.
Okay, so say the question again, because I'm like, magical realism is one of my shiny objects, so I'm like, ooh, magical realism. So tell me what the first part of the story of the question was.
Your writing process and how magical realism, how it takes part in that. This was a long question, and when we were dividing up the questions, I said, oh, wow. The second part of it is, how do you take an idea and develop it to get the finished product? And are the fairy tales you use to inspire your stories the tales you've always loved? Which we know the answer is yes, because you've talked about that. But that was the whole section. Thanks, Celia.
Sorry.
So tell us about your writing process and how magical realism plays such a huge part in it.
I love these questions, and I love questions that have like these different directions to go in. It just means that sometime I might be like, okay, what was the question again? This happens to me all the time on panels when I'll like listen to someone's answer and I'll get so absorbed in it that I'll be like, oh wait, yeah, I'm supposed to answer this too. So with my writing process, this is something I'm still kind of figuring out, which feels a little weird this many books in, but I also think it's kind of wonderful that I still get to figure this out, that I'm still sort of shaping how I do things, that it's a little bit different every time. And part of the process, though, that I've noticed every single time involves a lot of handwriting. And I like writing. I like writing on actual paper. Sometimes it's like it's the flurry of Post-it notes that goes everywhere. Sometimes it's in a notebook. But the process of being able to sort of map out ideas and draw arrows and like draw little pictures, and being able to write in ways that like nobody has to decode except me, that's the one part that seems to happen every single book, is like, okay, I'm gonna write things down. I'm going to like cluster sets of words over here. I'm gonna draw bubbles over here. So as I'm doing that, as I'm sort of building this writing process, I love this question because I love hearing about other writers' writing process and thinking like, oh, that's really interesting that you put like you need your tea specifically here, like you put your phone in a box or something. Like I love hearing about this from other writers because my process is kind of always evolving, and I'm sort of looking for those little pieces, like what do I do every time, and what do I want to learn to do, and what do I want to try out. So even though I sort of have just this one touchstone of like writing by hand, this is a question I love because I always get to hear about it from other writers. So in terms of magical realism, there's two big things that come to mind for me with magical realism, because I think of magical realism as finding the beautiful and the extraordinary in the midst of oppression. So that's one part of it, and another part of it is the idea of that beautiful and that extraordinary being communal. Like it belongs much more to the community than it does to any individual person. Mm-hmm. There's also sort of under that is this idea of the unpredictability of the beautiful, of the extraordinary, of what you might call the magic in these stories. Because it's like water. It's going to go everywhere, and it's going to come up places that you don't expect. And often it's going to tell your secrets. It's going to tell you things that your community either doesn't know, or that your community isn't talking about, or that you don't want to face. And it's ultimately, even though it's going to be very inconvenient and frightening at times, it's going to help get you, and in some cases your community gets you somewhere better. So those ideas sort of coming together, finding that which doesn't make you forget oppression, doesn't make you forget the tragic, but helps you survive in the midst of it. That for me is at the core of magical realism. That alongside the idea of like, this is something we collectively hold, our history, the magic we find, the beautiful, the extraordinary. This is all something that we hold together. So I think of that really at the heart of magical realism, and that's what keeps coming with me into every story. Like what are we finding that keeps us going, and that keeps our hearts strong, and that keeps the light in our hearts? And what are we finding that is telling us things that we need to address, and things we need to know, and things we need to see?
That's so beautiful. I wonder, the handwriting, like Post-its or maybe notebooks that you're writing in, do you keep those after, or once the process is done, you chuck them, you get rid of them?
I think it depends. Sometimes it's clear that I'm never going to be able to read them again, because I'm writing them so quickly that it's just like, oh, okay, like I can't even read that. So I don't necessarily keep those. Sometimes I do keep them though, especially like when I draw little pictures, like when I wrote Wild Beauty, like you'll see the cover behind me. I needed a map of La Pradera, because I kept mixing up where different things were, and for a little while I got away with it, but I forget who it was. It might have been my editor, who was like, wait, these different gardens are moving around, and not like in a magical realism way, but in a like, I'm not sure that you're keeping track of where everything is. And I thought, okay, you're right. So I drew this map of where these different parts of these gardens were. Mm-hmm. And that ended up being a process that was really important to me, because in that particular case, magical realism, as it often is to me, is so often tied to the ground underneath you. It's tied to the land, to your history with the land. And in the case of Wild Beauty, you have these gardens that are fighting back, that are fighting for their history to be heard, that are trying to get these women who put their hands into this earth, who have this connection with this earth, who grow these gardens. It's trying to talk to them. So it wasn't until I did those drawings and I said, okay, this is here, this is here, this is here, that I thought, okay, I needed to know this to really understand how the land is talking. And I think I do that a lot. I think drawing often helps me figure out these pieces, not only of the physical geography, but of the magical realism, whether that's going to be like where the swans in the forest are in Blanca y Roja, or where the red shoes are taking Rosea. Knowing that, and knowing the sort of drawing out the geography of it, helps me get a little deeper into the magic of it.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
So for the characters in the books, you write, your book explores different identities within the LGBT QIA spectrum. How did you find the different voices for each character, and where do your characters come from?
So, oh god, this question has got this question gets more interesting as I think like more recently what's happened with writing some of my characters. I'll get to that in a minute. So, okay. With I think a lot of finding my characters, like whether it's their personality, their identity, anything about them, a lot of it comes through listening, and listening just kind of means the process of being able to sort of have that character at the back of my head a little bit, and let them tell me something about themselves, or get an idea about them and figure out if it's right. And the reason I say this is an interesting question is because in some ways, like my characters found their identities before I did. Like I recently came out as non-binary. My pronouns are they, them. And I came out in the middle of Dark and Deepest Red's production process. I'm very grateful and very excited about the fact that like I got my they them pronouns in my bio, which meant a lot to me. But figuring that out, like figuring out that I was non-binary, that there was a part of me that was a trans boy when I had written a book about like a medieval trans boy, it was a really interesting experience being like, okay, I've written 4 books with trans and non-binary characters, and it took me this long to realize like who I am, to realize everything about who I am. Not that we ever not that we ever completely realize everything about ourselves, but this was a big element of my identity that I had written on the page, and that my characters knew about themselves before I did. There's this one part in Blanca y Roja, which is like I call my like queer Latinx Swan Lake. There's this part where Paige, who uses alternating pronouns, uses she and her and he and him, talks about the story of the ugly duckling, and says the story of the ugly duckling is not about discovering you have become beautiful. It's about realizing that who you are is more beautiful than what you once thought you had to be. And looking back on that now and realizing what I was telling my community and what I was telling myself. I knew I was telling that to my community. I did not know I was telling that to myself when I wrote that. And looking back on that now, it's this sort of big moment that I did not realize was a big moment until I look back and think like, oh, that was me in some of these characters. So we learn about our I think our creative brains, I think our storyteller brains are sometimes ahead of where we are. And that's okay, because we get there, because our hearts are there, and they're sort of waiting for us to get there. So writing Dark and Deepest Red, when I was writing about these two brown girls 500 years apart that my heart is very much in, and then realizing that my heart is also in this transgender boy in 1518 Strasbourg who knows who he is, but doesn't necessarily like have the language for it that we have now. And looking at that and realizing, oh, there was a lot that my storyteller heart knew about me before I did.
The next question, can you talk more about being your authentic self and how writing assisted in that process, which I think you explained. I do want to ask, a question came in, so before I lose it, because there's some other comments, is what has inspired your creativity during stay at home?
Oh gosh. I think a lot of it has been reading, and especially like I often read based on recommendations from friends, and I'm doing that even more now because reading it's not only a way to connect with an author, it's a way to connect with the person who's recommending the book to you, because then you can go back and you can talk about it. So that's something that's been pretty special for me, is like hearing people's book recommendations and thinking like, okay, like reading that is going to be a way to know more about this author, and also to talk to this friend who recommended this book, and also like sending friends books or sending friends book recommendations. That's been something that's been big too, to sort of like have this conversation. And even though that's more about my reader brain than my writer brain, I think they're so connected that that fueling your reader brain is going to fuel your writer brain. So that's been pretty meaningful to me right now. And also like I've been writing like physical letters and postcards to friends. And something about that, like I was talking a little bit about handwriting and trying not to judge my own handwriting, and just like doing that in a way and putting that out into the world is sort of fueling that part of my brain that wakes up a little when I'm able to detach and think like, okay, I don't care what my handwriting on this Post-it note looks like. I don't care what my drawings of flowers are going to look like when I draw this map of these gardens. I think that's been really important too. So whatever wakes up your creative brain, because that's different. It's going to be different for everybody. And sort of going toward that in a way that's possible right now, because we're in a very different world, and it means that some of the things that may do that for your brain may not be possible right now. But often there is something that is, and growing that and giving that more space can be something that can really help fuel that storyteller, that creative part of you.
So are there any books that you've been reading that have particularly inspired you, or anything that you're looking forward to that's coming out?
Yes, this is an amazing year for books. I say that every year. I mean it every year. So I wrote some down so that I can so that I can not go on forever and just highlight a couple of ones that I've loved recently. So one that came out earlier this year is I.W. Gregorio's "This Is My Brain in Love."
Yeah.
I absolutely loved her first book, None of the Above. I have been eagerly waiting her follow-up. I'm so glad it's here. And it just has this beautiful sense of recognizing what it feels like when your brain is sort of buzzing with anxiety, and giving that space on the page, but also letting these characters see their full selves. That what's going on in the back of their brains it's an important part of them, but it's also not all of who they are. And I think that's one that I'm recommending more and more lately, because of that beautiful balance of giving that space, but also showing the full lives of these characters on this page. A couple of other ones. I'll say two that I've loved recently, and a related one that I'm excited about. So I absolutely love The Voting Booth by Brandy Colbert. I love Brandy Colbert's books so much. I have since her debut. The Voting Booth was just spectacular, and it was just one of those books where it was exactly the book my heart wanted at that time, and I'm like, okay, this is a book I will be recommending to everyone. So I love that so much. I am so excited whenever one of Brandy's books comes out. A book that I'm looking forward to that just came out a few weeks ago is Christina Forrest's. I think it's called Now That I've Found You. It's her second book, and I'm looking forward to it because I absolutely adored her first book, I Want to Be Where You Are, which is I just love the main character of that book so much. She just has one of those voices that you could just you just want to stick with. You just want to hear more from her, and it's a book that I would love to wish I could go back and hand to teen me. It's just this beautiful book about a Black ballerina, and just beautifully shows her inner life and her relationships with everyone around her, while showing this incredible love for dance and this drive toward dance. So I'm really excited to read her follow-up. So those are a few of the ones that I've adored this year, and that I'm looking forward to.
Great.
Thanks. The cover art for Mirror Season was recently revealed, and it's stunning, as is the cover art for all your other novels. We were discussing this before. As an author, how involved are you in the cover art process?
So I am so fortunate to be able to work with some absolutely incredible artists and designers. I love my covers. They are just gorgeous art that I'm so lucky to have on my stories. And typically they'll talk with me a little bit about the cover ahead of time, but often it's the designer and artist reading the story and sort of going in the direction that they have this incredible vision. So I often don't have a lot to do with them, other than saying okay, this is the book, this is the story, I trust you to make it beautiful, because they always do. One thing that was a little different on Mirror Season is okay, so I'll preface this with saying Mirror Season is it's in part about sexual assault, so I'll say that as a content warning for talking about it. So with Mirror Season, I knew I was going to be writing this book about these two survivors, one of whom is a Latina girl and one of whom is a boy, and this unlikely friendship they have after both being assaulted at the same party. And something that I had to, again, going back to the idea of letting identity into a story, I had to both realize that I was doing that. I was writing this about a brown girl and a boy, because this was sort of how I experienced being a survivor, with my range of gender identities. I experienced being a survivor as as a Latina girl. I experienced being a survivor as a boy, and having that experience, those experiences be in one book was really how I spoke from my heart as a sexual assault survivor. And another thing I had to sort of let into this book is writing about like being a queer sexual assault survivor, which is something that I didn't think that I could do. I didn't think that that was something I should do, and I still can't quite put my finger on why, except that at first I didn't think that I could write about that in a book about sexual assault and also celebrate that identity. And as I was writing this book and letting that identity in, I felt like this is exactly the kind of story where you need to celebrate identity. Like the story of being a survivor is when you need to learn to celebrate, like being queer, like being mixed race Latina, whatever it is that you are as a survivor, learning to celebrate that either for the first time or again. So letting that in and letting that theme really come through was something that went into the cover process, because Sierra, who's the one who's narrating this story, she's a pansexual Latina girl, and this book, like the short way I can talk about this book sometimes is like pansexuality and pan dulce. So I asked, like, okay, with the cover, like, you always do beautiful covers, like I don't want to, like, you always do things that I could never, like McMillan always does things I could never imagine that are absolutely beautiful. But I asked, could we have like pansexual flag colors for this cover? And I kind of like just asked that and sort of let go of it, and they did it. And I'm so happy that they did it, because this cover is pink and yellow and blue. So I love having that sort of nod to the idea that you hold on, like you survive in part by holding on to who you are and claiming who you are. And that's part of what Ciela does throughout the story. And so that's like, that's the most specific ask I think I've ever had for a cover. And I'm so like grateful that they went with it, because I love that I have pansexual flag colors on this cover.
Yeah, it's a beautiful cover. Like, I can't wait to read it. I'm so excited. So we're really excited for Mirror Season, and Miss Meter comes out next week, so we're also very excited for that. I've got mine on pre-order, so can't wait. Have you started your next project? Oh my gosh! I'm really excited to read it. But so, have you started your next project, or do you have an idea of what you're going to do next?
So I'll think about what I can say about it, but before I sort of calibrate what I'm allowed to say about it yet, I will say that I just turned it in like 2 hours ago, like right before I came in for this. So so I love this question. I'm really grateful for this question. I'm sort of in that first flush of like, okay, I've handed it off. So I can't say too much about it yet, but I will say that I'm working on a couple of projects at the same time, and I kind of love the fact that they could not be more different, except for the fact that they both are really, really centered in Latinx identity, in queer and trans and non-binary identity. So those are sort of at the center of both of them, but they're both very different projects that I'm really excited about, and I can't wait to share more with you about them.
Oh my God, okay. Really excited about it. Sorry. Now I'm like fangirling about it. But thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to see if we have any more questions in the comments.
Lots of people sending love. I see that.
All right. So thank you so much for joining us. As you can tell, Diane and I are huge fans, messaging each other as we read. So thank you so much. We hope that everybody enjoyed this conversation with the author. Please make sure to join us for our next Your Author program with Isabel Inez. So we'll be discussing her latest book. It'll be next Friday, September 25th at 4 p.m. And check out the remaining pre-LA Libros Festival programs on our website at lapl.org.
Stage. Plus, And don't forget, yeah, we'll be at Libros both interviewing amazing authors. And we thank you so much for joining us. And to the Greenbergs again, thank you for letting us have this amazing program that we can share with, people across the world, not just Los Angeles. So.
Thank you so much for having me and for this wonderful conversation. I'm so excited that I got to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. It was great. We learned so much.
Amazing. And we hope you've inspired other people to pick up your books, which we do have at the library. You can put holds, both the hard copies and the ebooks.
I still can't believe it. I don't think I would have believed it if anyone had told me, like when I was in going into Central Branch, like, hey, your books are going to be here one day. I would think I would have been like, what, really? So that's that's amazing to hear, even now. So thank you.
We have them there. You'll have to come and sign them all too.
I would love that.
Yeah.
We hope everyone has an amazing weekend, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Adios.
Yes.